Welcome to week 7, everybody. Hard to believe it, but here we are, 7 of the 10 weeks in. Yep, and today's workshop is one that I'll be leading on called Dollars and Cents, which is largely a conversation about margin or profit margin and how you can think about it in the context of sales. Just per usual, please do take a second to rename yourself with the name of your cohort number as the first part of your name. And here's the shot of everybody's names and numbers. So while you're doing that, I'm going to just remind us where we are in the overall program. Yes, 7 of the 10 weeks in. So we have turned the corner. We're on the home stretch. We have this and 2 more lectures to deliver, and then we'll be going into our graduation. And so with that, I'm going to hand it to Caroline to talk us through a little bit more of the prep.
Thanks, Raj, and good morning, Rainmakers. I'm so excited that you guys are back and ready to hear an awesome program from Raj. Raj is an incredible guy. I know many of you know him and some of you who are working with him in the cohort, but Raj is not only bringing you some content about, how to make sure that, you're pricing your products correctly and really thinking about margins so that you don't have what's called an upside down business model, that it doesn't cost you $2 to sell something for $1, right? And really share his real life experience doing this at Young Mountain Tea. And that's really what we want to bring you, as you've seen in the programming that we've been providing, is real life people doing real life business stuff. And then we're really excited to have Peter Thorson, if Peter can wave his hand, with Palo Alto Software, and their signature product is LivePlan, which is a really great subscription product that helps you not only think through your plan, but more keep that plan alive by syncing it up with accounting tools like QuickBooks so that you can track what you're actually doing against what you said you were going to do. And Peter and I got to work together several years at Palo Alto, and he's on hand to chime in, answer questions, and this is one area of expertise that he brings to the table. So you've got 2 awesome speakers, but also we know many of you are also experts in various things. We've got a ton of mentors on to support you all today. Just raise your hand if you're a mentor or a cohort facilitator to remind everybody. And if you know an answer to something, feel free to chime in. We all know a little something about something. So thank you, Raj. If you can go to the next slide for me. And next week, we're really excited to have Caitlin Gill with us, who's going to focus on, the nitty gritty of helping you make it rain. And by making it rain, of course, we mean generating sales. And Caitlin we're lucky to have her in our community. She's in Corvallis, but we're lucky to have her in Oregon is what I should say. She leads the OSU Sales Academy, which is a rare program for a university because it's extremely focused on how do you make cold calls? How do you make warm calls? How do you pick up the phone? How do you walk into a place? How do you sell at expos? It's literally all about the sales part. So the first part of our RAINmaker was really more focused on the marketing side, and sales and marketing obviously go hand in hand. But she has a lot of industry background. She held high-level positions at Insight Software, Global Software, and SageWorks. And so this is not a session you want to miss, especially because the homework she's going to give you is going to be recording a sales pitch, a less than 60-second sales pitch, which everybody's pitch should not last longer than a minute. And when you're trying to sell something anyway, if it takes longer than that, you kind of need to revisit what it is that you're trying to communicate as your value proposition. And what's important about her homework is that is how our team is going to review all of those videos, and we're going to use that to select the top 4 or 5 who are actually going to deliver 3-minute pitches on graduation day. So you'll learn more about that in a minute, but you don't want to miss next week. And we have a lot of legislators that reach out to us now and then when they're trying to change laws, they're trying to make policies to help you with your businesses. And most recently, U.S. Senator Wyden's office reached out to us, and he wants to know if any of you are having issues with the U.S. Postal Service. Anybody who's listening to the news is very aware of what's happening on that front. He's trying to get in there and pass some policies, and there's been some movement lately, but they want to hear your story. So if you have a business that depends on the U.S. Postal Service, and you're having issues, please reach out to me. My email is at the bottom there, and I will connect you to Senator Wyden's team, who is leading that on the front lines in DC. And then if any of you are still waiting on your pandemic unemployment insurance checks, I know some of you are, Oregon Senator Arnie Roblin, wants to talk to you. He's also been appointed by the governor, if you don't know, to chair the emergency board. So his board has been the group who's been putting together all of the emergency funds, those grant funds that many of the cities and counties have. And again, they need real stories to take back to Salem. So if anybody is having issues with that, please email me. And you can use my Gmail or my RAIN, which is caroline@oregonrain.org. Next slide, Raj. Okay, so you guys took the survey. Thank you so much, because we want to hear from you what is working, what isn't working, and also what you wanted in workshop 9, which was the cohort's choice. And the top 3 were search engine optimization, paid ads, and how to sell using social media, specifically how to sell. And Anvil Media in Portland, who both Laura Kubishak and I have known for many, many years, and they are extremely well respected. They've been doing this work for over 15 years. And Kent, the owner, CEO, is going to be leading that session. What's great about Anvil and Kent is they are also the group that we selected in that Business Oregon grant. If you all remember, we ended up getting a little less than a third of the money, but we're still going to be working with Anvil to work with all of you on paid ads, specifically Google AdWords, landing page development, and analytics, so that you can really optimize that quicker sales funnel and not have to optimize your actual full website to test out getting sales, because we all know that's what this is all about. We want you to keep your doors open, and we want you to thrive beyond COVID. So you don't want to miss workshop 9. Next, Raj. And I just want to remind everybody about the prizes. So we've seen a little, folks, it was 19 companies were eligible, and now we have 25 companies that are eligible. And there's 77 of you as far as companies. There's more entrepreneurs, but there's 77 companies who have been regularly participating in RAINmaker, which is awesome. But please get your homework in. I know I've talked with many of you so that you could be eligible to receive $1,000 so that you can actually use the money to run Google Ads and make sure that your calls to action, your value proposition is working. And then if it is, you can just keep feeding the funnel there. Next one, Raj. And the other thing that we're working on is in order to pitch at the graduation for an additional $1,000, first place will be $1,000, second place will be the 90-minute consultation from Rachel. We're also raising more money from folks who will be attending. We're hoping to get at least 200 people to attend your graduation. We're going to be inviting a lot of elected officials and CEOs from all over Oregon, mentors, really powerhouse folks, private foundations who are all excited to meet you and hear what you're working on. But to compete in that, to have the opportunity to receive the additional $1,000, as I mentioned earlier, you have to submit that 1-minute video recording your sales pitch. It doesn't have to be a video, by the way, you guys. It can be an audio recording, and we don't want anything fancy. Don't even worry about trying to set the right lighting or whatever. We just need to hear your pitch. You can record it on your phone. You can get someone else to record it. Don't worry about doing any fancy editing. This is really just to give you an opportunity to practice that sales pitch. And then, of course, we'll be compiling them and editing them and turning it into some really cool montage that we can share around. Next.
And one thing to add to that, Caroline,
yeah,
is next week's workshop is focused purely on that. So if you're not feeling ready for it yet, don't worry. After next week,
good point.
You will.
Thanks, Raj. And then this is a way to practice if you want to do the video or the audio, is if you can send a less than 60-second recording. This will be a part of your homework that Raj will talk about, where literally you can just say, my name is Caroline Cummings. I'm the founder of Vero Ventures. One thing I learned from RAINmaker is how to make sure I'm pricing my products correctly. And one of the things I'm going to do differently as a result of this is I'm going to run a few Google ad campaigns with different headlines to test what's working. Boom, done. That's something that it'll help you actually think through the 3 things that most videos and audios shouldn't have more than 3 things in them that you're trying to focus on. And again, nothing fancy. And Raj will talk more about that later. And by the way, that will help us get more money. We're still trying to raise more money to help with everything that you're doing between now and the end of the calendar year. And then Raj, I'll turn it back to you so that we can move into the program. Thank you guys. I'm staying on. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the chat. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And just to remind us all that there is an offer on the table from the 2 lawyers who joined us last week from Cronin Law. And this is for a free consultation with both of them. To take advantage of that, you just need to email ryan@croninlawfirm.com. In addition, after you've done that startup checkup, that's what they're calling that initial consultation, you'll be eligible for 15% discount on any of their flat fee services. And this is something that's running through the end of September. And if anybody has already done that startup checkup in the chat, it'd be great to hear what your experience was. I can say I did it for my business and was very impressed at how in just 45 minutes, there were some really helpful nuggets that came out. For me, it was the understanding of the difference between S Corps and C Corps in a little bit more detail. And it looks like Stacy also had a good conversation yesterday, so I'm glad to hear it and hope that all of you will take advantage of this because, you know, lawyers are expensive. So get free access if you can. Of course, we do want to just thank our sponsors, all 3 of them that have been contributing regularly, Banner Bank Peak and the SBDC up in Lynn Benton, as well as Lane. Okay, let's dive in. I am excited to be able to share with you a little bit of my experience and learnings from really delving deep into this concept of margin, which is also called profit margin. We're going to refer to it throughout today as margin for short, which really is one of the most important high-level metrics that an organization can track. And that's what we're going to focus on, understanding what it is, how to calculate it, and then breaking it down into the 2 pieces that comprise it, the revenue and the costs, and then putting them back together at the end with an activity. There will be some math involved in this. There will be some spreadsheets, but fortunately, it's all the kind of math that I have a lot of confidence that you are all well familiar with. It's mainly subtraction and division. But just to know that this is kind of the math session for what we're presenting in the RAINmaker. And the reason I was really interested in sharing this particular topic back in, I guess it was mid-May when we were first brainstorming the curriculum, is because I have found that this concept of margin, once it's become internalized, has been one of the most important lessons for me in building Young Mountain to date. So just briefly, I always like to know a little bit about who's talking when I'm in a call. So I wanted to share my biography. I grew up in a really small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I studied engineering there, and then went, because both my parents are from India, back to India after college and spent about 5 years bouncing between the US and India, working primarily with villages on issues of solar electrification. And that work got me very interested generally in the ways that Western markets can help support livelihood creation at the village level. So in 2013, I started Young Mountain Tea as a way to kind of bridge the 2 worlds that I felt I belonged to, rural India and the US. And our goal is to work with small farmers to raise the quality of their teas as high as we can, and then direct import those teas and sell them in the US. So it's hard to believe, but this is going to be our 7th year of business, actually September 17th, the day after RAINmaker wraps up. Through kind of building that business and taking advantage of opportunities like RAINmaker, I got connected into the entrepreneurial ecosystem and then joined the Oregon Rain team in 2019. So for about a year and a half and a little bit more than that, I've had the privilege of getting to work with many of you on this call, and it's really been a pleasure to understand sort of the diversity of business challenges that exist and the tools that are out there to address them. And I do want to say that on this concept of margin, a lot of what I have learned has come through my own personal experience, but then also talking to mentors. And I just want to underline the importance of mentors in building a business. I have found that having a diverse network of committed mentors to be such a game changer in terms of building the business. So there's a number of them on this call. I'm sure you have them in your networks, but whatever you can do to foster their higher level involvement in what you're doing pays a lot. Because it's expensive to learn the hard way, and it's best if you can to take advantage of other people's existing expertise. And then, yeah, so on this concept of margin, I wanted to share how I got to get intimately familiar with it. And it was by working primarily with these two gentlemen pictured here. And it was on the way to securing our largest account and almost doing it at a loss. And that was because of the way I didn't really factor in margin into some of the conversations that was happening. The guy on the right there, that's Seth. He's the supply manager for Frontier Co-op, which is a national tea and herbs and spices distributor that's based out of rural Iowa. Actually, they were started by a group of truckers that banded together and decided to distribute. And we had met at a networking event in San Francisco and actually connected over having odd-shaped business cards. And 9 months later, had got to the point of talking about us selling tea to Frontier. And at that point, we were going through about 2,000 pounds of tea in a year. And Frontier was interested in starting with the purchase of about 2,500 pounds of tea. So we were very interested in figuring out how to make it work. And the price was one of the parts that we were working our way through. And so the offer that we made to Frontier was going to earn us about a 12% margin. And at that point, we were selling mainly through grocery stores where we were earning about 50% margin, and then also through our website, direct to consumers, and getting about 75% margin there. So we were used to discounting between 15 and 20% on sort of one-off sales. So when Seth came back and said they were very interested, but they need the price to be about 15% less than our offer, it seemed within reason. And because this was a fast-moving conversation, we wanted to close it and wrap it up. I said, sure, let's do it, let's commit, without really checking into it. The problem was that in retrospect, we realized that we couldn't commit to that price because we would actually be selling it at a loss. So that's when this gentleman on the left, Desmond, who's our main tea supplier, came into the picture, and he shared that, you know what, he recognized the importance of this sale to our work and to his community. And so he was willing to sell us the tea at a slightly lower price if we could get a slightly better one with Seth and Frontier. And so it kind of became this three-way conversation between me, Desmond, and Seth to pull it all together. And in that process, what I realized is that understanding margin before committing to a sales price is a really important thing. But in addition to that, having strong relationships with both your suppliers and your customers so you can navigate those kinds of things is also equally important. And I'm happy to report that Frontier is now one of our strongest customers, and the relationship is a great one that led to Seth coming over to India and spending some time in Desmond's tea garden, which is the one we got pictured here. So that's that. I just wanted to share where I came to understand that where margin fits into the bigger picture. And I know that a lot of you have already pretty deeply engaged with this content. So I just wanted to start with a question and see where we're at. If you can put in the chat, what do you think margin is? What does it mean to you? And how do you use it in your day-to-day? And I'll offer that one of the things in talking with mentors and our financial advisor is that it's a bit of an ambiguous term and it's used differently in different contexts. So one of the things we'll do is define what that is. Oh, good, people are coming through. Place where profitability lives, amount earned after expenses, your markup from COGS. Margin is the ratio between cost and price. Margin, oh, well, okay, now I can't keep up with them, great. Well, it sounds like we're very well familiar with a lot of these concepts. And I'm a visual person, so this is the way I think of it. At the highest level, it's fairly a simple principle. It's the difference between how much you earn and how much you spend. And so really there's two parts to it, and that's it, just the revenue and the cost. However, it gets a lot more complicated when you start to think about how it can be applied. And this idea of margin can exist at different levels in the business. So you can look at the margin on the business as a whole, which often gets called net income or profitability. You can look at it for an individual sales channel. So comparing, say, how your margin through selling direct to consumer through your website compares to selling it to a store. Or you can look at it at the individual product level or service level if you're a service-based business and compare how much you're earning on each individual sale of a product. In addition to the different levels that you can look at margin, there's two primary types that we often talk about. Gross margin, which is just looking at if you take away the variable costs, which are the types of costs that increase as you sell more out of the revenue. That's the gross margin, which typically for product-based businesses shows up on your books as cost of goods sold or COGS, or cost of sales for service-based businesses. Or you can look at the net margin, which is if you take out both the variable and the fixed costs from revenue, what's left over. And so that differentiation between gross versus net is an important one, and you can use them for different purposes. In the context of sales, what typically shows up most and is the most useful at the individual product or sales channel level is the gross margin, because you're not looking at as close at all the fixed costs. And so here's just a way to kind of pull apart the two types of gross versus net. So here's the profit and loss. Thanks to Paul's Plumbing Company for uploading a profit and loss statement to Wikipedia and letting it be free for us to use. So we've got the familiar lines, the total income up at the top, the revenue, the cost of goods sold down below that, and then further down the expenses. And these are the two spots where we might look at the two types of margin. So gross margin, again, being revenue minus the cost of goods sold. And then if you take out the expenses from that, the net margin that shows up. So hopefully that just kind of drills at home the differentiation between the two types. In addition to that, you can also talk about margin, both as a percent as well as a dollar value. And there's different reasons you might use one versus the other. Percent is often more helpful if you're looking at two different options. So you've got more of an apples to apples comparison, whereas dollars is often more important for understanding, do I have enough money? Will I have enough money in my bank account to pay whatever bills are coming? And so for today, putting this all together, we're going to use the term margin to represent the gross margin percent. So we're only going to look at taking the variable costs out of the sales price. So we're not going to look at the overhead or any fixed costs, and we're going to report these as percent so we can use them for comparison purposes. Okay, now let's actually get down to it. Here is the formula for figuring out what our margin is. As I said, there's only two variables involved, there's revenue and cost. And you subtract one from the other, and then to get into a percent, you're going to divide by one of these two. So in the chat, please go ahead and drop in, what do you think should go in the denominator of this fraction? Is it the revenue that we're talking about when we talk about margin, or is it the cost? A couple votes for revenue so far. Oh, with a question mark. We'll have one vote for both. Revenue looks like it's emerging up at the top, which is great because that is indeed the case. Yes, it is the revenue. And if there's anything that you take from the entire presentation, I hope it is this fraction. What we do is we take out the cost from the revenue and we divide it by the revenue. This is an important part because it's a simple fraction, but it's one that dictates a lot of the way the business operates. And then because a lot of times this is happening inside of a spreadsheet, remember PEMDAS? Everybody remember that from elementary school? Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally or Susan or whatever the S related person in your life is. We need to make sure that in putting in these formulas, we are including the parentheses there because otherwise the cost will get divided by the revenue first. So when we get to the spreadsheet part, we'll hammer that home a little harder. But yes, this is the formula. And I want to just also share how margin is different as a concept than markup. They're pretty similar in terms of both being fractions that get divided, but they get divided by different things. So in the case of revenue, margin, we divide by the overall revenue, whereas in markup, we divide by the cost. And so to put some numbers behind that, if we were looking at a margin, say with a sales price of 10 and a cost of 4, we would subtract 10 minus 4 to get a 60% margin here, whereas we would just divide by the 4, and you can see that these numbers are quite different. And again, what we are talking about with revenue, or sorry, with margin is focusing on this fraction again, revenue in the denominator.
Raj, Tanya's asking a question. When would you use one versus the other?
When would you use margin versus markup?
I don't know, Tanya, do you want to unmute?
Well, trusting that is.
When would you use markup versus margin?
Honestly, I don't ever use markup. I feel like it's something that people refer to a lot, and it kind of, sometimes people discuss it in the context of like, in conversation with buyers, they share what their markups are that they need, in our case, to sell on the grocery store shelves. But in making business decisions, we only ever use margin. Does any of the other mentors want to weigh in on that?
Hey, Raj, I got a...
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, for people who resell things, markup is, so if you buy an item that comes in a box and you sell it in that same box, or you spruce it up and sell it in a different box, like people who resell things love markup, and it helps you compare how you're doing compared to competition in particular. So markup's good for that purpose. And then I would just caution universally everyone, the idea of like comparing how much you spend on all the parts that go into a really complicated widget that you sell, or the amount of cost of the leaves that go into Raj tea compared to the thing that finally sells is a really bad metric. So a lot of times you'll hear from people like, oh, there's only 10 cents worth of flour in this really complicated crepe. Well, who cares? Like, that's not a good way to determine what your actual cost is. So margin's really good for, in my opinion, resellers more than anything else. Otherwise, yeah. See, so it's huge for someone here. For the rest of us, not so much, maybe. Sorry, Marty.
Gross margin will answer the question of the price I just sold this for. What percentage of that is profit? And markup says, of the price I just sold this for, how much more than our cost is this? So if you bought something for $1 and sold it for $2, what is your gross margin? Well, if you sold it for $2 and $1 of that is profit, then your gross margin is 50%. But if you said the same exact question, I sold this for $2, it cost me $1, what was my markup? My markup was 100%. I sold it for 100% more than the price I paid for it. So retailers like to work a lot off of markup, just because it's easier for them to calculate, and they're often working at between 34 to 50% margins. And so it's easy for them to just say, okay, mark it up 100%, and that gives me 50% margins. But yeah, they're answering kind of two sides of the same, two questions based on the same transaction.
It can also help you differentiate between the types of customers. For instance, we had a door shop, and the doors cost the same to make, whoever we sold them to. But we also had different markups for different types of customers, wholesale customers. We did Habitat for Humanity, who we charged less than we would have charged a normal retail customer. So it can be very helpful, because the margin was the same, how much we actually made on the door, but the markup was a whole lot different. So it does help you differentiate between customers sometimes too. Cool.
Well, thanks. And I imagine in the breakouts, we can dig in deeper if that is something, but it's certainly a concept that they are two sides of the same coin, but can be used for different purposes. So let's dive in by thinking through this for ourselves. And to do that, let's clean up with an example. So we already kind of touched on this one, but imagine that you sold a bar of soap for 10 bucks. And thanks to Annie from Bonita for offering Love Bar Butters photography for this example. And let's say it costs you $4 to make that soap. Please drop in the chat, what would the margin be? You sell it for 10 and it costs you $4 to make it. Yep, great. I guess it doesn't hurt that we already put the screen up already, the slide up. But yes, the answer is 60%. That's right. So we do 10 minus 4 to get 6, and that gets divided by 10. So the margin on that bar of soap is 60%. So that's an easy one. That was a warm-up. Let's go a little deeper. Which do you think has a larger impact on your margin? If you have an increase in your sales price of $1 or a decrease in your costs of $1? So it looks like the majority of folks are saying that a decrease in cost will have a bigger impact. Well, let's figure it out. Check out this COVID appropriate sign for $1. I found this, George Washington. So are you all now seeing my spreadsheet that's open?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So up in the upper right, uh-oh, what's going on? 1 second. Oh no.
Raj, I don't think you can be full screen for some reason, but if you...
1 second. There we go. Are you seeing it now? Everything working? Yeah. So if we do the formula, and because we're in spreadsheets, we always start with an equal sign if we want to do a formula. We're going to do the price minus the cost divided by the price to get 60%. That's the same one we did before. So if we're going to increase the price by $1, that goes up to $11. We're going to say the cost is the same. And I'm just going to copy this formula from the cell over here. And we can see that, okay, if we increase the price by $1, we get a 4% bump in our margin. And then if we look at decreasing the cost by $1, we keep the price the same. We reduce the cost by $1 to $3, and then copy this formula over. Yes, everybody was indeed correct. We have a 10% bump in margin. So the comparison is, this is kind of differentiating between gross versus net, right? In either way, there's $1 more that is coming to your pocket. But as a percent, there's a larger increase in margin when that is come about by a decrease in cost. So the punchline here is that lowering costs has a bigger impact on margin than increasing revenue when you compare things in a dollar-to-dollar basis. Okay, and then I also wanted to go big into discounts. Discounts are a huge part of negotiation, and knowing what leeway you have to give up on which products is often important. As I shared, I didn't really have a clear sense of that when I was having our conversations with Frontier, and it almost cost us a lot of money. And it comes up in conversations a lot when getting into stores, when discussing bulk sales of services, or my favorite place the discounts come up are in farmers markets, when you're having a good conversation with a friend about somebody who's looking for a deal. So let's go through another example. Let's say you give a 20% discount on a good, on a product. How is your margin impacted by that? Is it going to be more, less, or the same as a 20% reduction in margin? And please go ahead and drop your answers in the chat. So this is saying if we take down the price by 20%, does our margin come down by 20%? Does it come down by more than 20%? Does it come down by less? Oh, good. Finally, we have one that we have a little bit of diversity in what we're talking about. Well, let's go ahead and figure it out. And to set that one up, here we go. So I'm gonna have to figure out how to get back into the spreadsheet. Okay. So to do this, let's look at 3 different situations. We have, in one case, that same first example where we have a 60% margin where the price is 10, the cost is 4. We have an example where we have a 20% margin where there's a $2 difference between the price and cost, and then we also have a 10% margin. So 3 different margins, all with the same sales price. I'm going to now unhide this to show. So what I did was set things up so that if we plug in a discount percent up here, that discount's going to be applied to the price here, and we'll see the updates in margin here. So if we put a 20% discount in, check out what happens. The price comes from $10 down to $8 in all 3 cases, and the cost remains the same in all 3 cases. And then the margin here on the 60% product, it goes from 60 to 50%, which is a minus 10%. So this is actually a less of an impact on the margin in the 60% case. In the case where the original margin was 20%, that 20% discount makes your selling price the same as your cost. And so actually you've given up all of the margin that you had on the product and you're not earning anything. So that's the same. And then in the last case where there's a 10% margin, now the sales price is actually below the cost and you lost more than 20, it's 23%. And so you're actually selling in this case at a loss. So the take home from this is that math is weird and that discounts affect margin in different ways depending on the original margin. And so really in thinking about this, you have to look at it a case-by-case basis to understand where you started and where you end up. And if the discount is more than the original margin, you'll be losing money on the sale. And yeah, Connie, I see you're asking, especially in the resources. Yes, it is. And it's actually part of the homework. Cool. So that is sort of the first treatment of what margin is, how it's calculated, and what affects it. Now let's move into pulling apart the 2 pieces of the margin, the price and the costs. And to do that, let's start with the costs. It's always, I feel like, helpful to go through the parts that aren't as fun before getting to the more juicy parts. So on the cost side, again, what we said, we're talking about gross margin for this example. So we're looking at the variable costs. And variable costs are those ones that increase as your sales increase. Which generally for product-based businesses are the cost of goods sold and the cost of sales for the service-based businesses. And in using this to understand what your costs are, what we don't want to include are any fixed costs that aren't affected by the amount of sales you make. So for an example, if we think about like a burger restaurant, in looking at what the variable costs are, we want to say, what are the things that will incrementally increase as we sell more? So things like the buns, the burgers themselves, and the seeds. Those are all things that would get factored into, in this case, the COGS. What things we wouldn't include in figuring out the costs for these formulas are the things that are more or less fixed, that don't fluctuate with the number of sales. Like, for example, the amount they're paying for the lease on the restaurant, or the insurance that you're paying. And so it's an interesting thing in that there is some gray area between what you differentiate as being fixed versus variable. For example, the number of servers you have on staff, that might increase as your sales go up. But if you feel like it's something that you can hold constant, then you would treat that as a fixed cost. And so each individual business has to make the determination on which kinds of costs go into which bucket. But when you do that, here's a general guidance for things to include in variable costs, things like materials, the cost of shipping those materials to you, the cost of storing them, and the cost of the labor that goes into actually making it, and any part of equipment that you might use to make the actual products. Things you wouldn't include, as we were mentioning, are things like office space, marketing expenses, insurance, advertising, things like financial expenses like interest or indirect labor that does help, but doesn't necessarily go into the cost of production like sales. So here's a question for you all. What is the most commonly missed variable cost for most of us new businesses? Please drop it in the chat. Couple votes for marketing related stuff, couple votes for labor. Well, in our experience, it is the labor part. It is your time. It is a really easy thing to not think that you should be factoring in the cost of your time into the cost of goods sold. But it is essential. And why? Because if you aren't planning for the day that you will be paying yourself or hiring somebody to do the work of production for you, you won't have an accurate view of how your business actually functions. And then you'll get hit by a very rude surprise when you try to incorporate somebody else in. So even if you're not paying yourself now, it's important to begin thinking about how to value your time because, well, first of all, it's the most important thing we all have as entrepreneurs. And because from the day that comes that you do want to pull money out either for yourself or to pay somebody, you want to have an accurate view of what is actually going into the costs of making the products. And it's kind of a tricky thing to figure out how much you should be using to value your time. For service-based businesses, it's a little bit more straightforward. The easiest way is just to use the hourly rate that you charge to determine how much your labor costs are. For product-based businesses, it's basically a process of doing a quick test run and looking at how much you make in a certain fixed interval of time, giving a market value to your time, say how much you want to be paid or how much you want to pay other people, and then dividing that cost of the time by the number of products that you make. And then again, yeah, for service-based businesses, most of the variable costs are going to be dominated by the time it takes you to actually provide the service. So for example, for a massage parlor, the time that you actually spend providing the massage would be the variable costs. What you wouldn't want to include in the variable costs are the amount of time that is spent on doing things like booking your services. Okay, so that's a quick treatment of the cost side of it. And now we're going to switch over to the other part on the prices and look at some tips for pricing. And so, yeah, I think the most important thing that I have come across is really the mentality in setting prices. It's this tricky balance of wanting to make sure that you are creating a true win-win situation for both you and your customers. You want to figure out a price that is going to be enough for you to keep the doors open while also making sure that your customers are getting good value, whether they're end consumers or stores. And this can become, for some founders, an antagonistic relationship with their customers where they feel like they're trying to gouge them for all their worth. Or it can become this process of giving away too much in the hopes of trying to keep all your customers happy. And it becomes a process of knowing your margins and understanding how you can create win-win. But again, going back to that first story about our negotiations with price with Frontier, there is win-win. And as long as it remains an open and fair dialogue, I find that you can often find solutions that you might not otherwise think possible. And so generally, just adopt your win-win, solutions-oriented mindset, and then go and ask your customers what kinds of prices they would be interested for your services as a way to just gauge what might be possible. Another really important part of understanding how to price your product is to understand where the market's at. So go study the competition. And for us, this is something we did regularly, was go to different grocery stores, look at the tea aisle, and then write down the prices of everything that we saw, or just take a picture and then figure out the prices afterwards. Now with the internet being what it is, it's a lot easier to find that information, but understand sort of what prices are already the norm and how you're going to fit in with what you offer. Another nice tip is to develop tiers to give options to your customers. And it's often the case that you can expect that many first-time customers might start on your lowest tier. However, you want to give people options so they feel like they have some variety in choosing. And this is actually an interesting thing that we learned from the wine industry. Anybody know what the most commonly purchased wine is on a list? It is the second from the bottom. Nobody wants to get the cheapest wine, but people don't want to necessarily pay the most. So making sure that you've got a variety of options so people don't feel like they're being cheap, but they're also not forking over too much is an important part. So make sure that you're thinking about ways that you can structure your pricing to give options to the customers. And then finally, just make sure that you're not pigeonholing yourself in too early. Again, things like discounts, things like involving other people in your supply chain, like distributors, or things like COVID that unexpectedly drive your costs up because shipping gets way more expensive. Those are all going to take hits on your margin. So make sure that you're giving yourself some padding above what you think you need right now, because in the future, there is a chance that you'll have to dip into it. And then, okay, so that's the cost side of it. And we're just gonna bring the two pieces together and talk about how to apply margin in a more direct way. And one of the questions that I was chatting about actually yesterday with somebody on this call was, what should my margins be? And that really is a tricky question to answer because it varies so much by industry, by the market that you're selling into, and things like sales channels. I was doing some searching and found these two resources that felt like pretty strong databases that had done the analysis of gross margin as percents. And I just want to share that these are some of the numbers that they say are standards for industries that we have in the RAINmaker right now. And you can see it's a pretty wide range. Hospitality often has in the 70s range, and brick and mortar retail is coming down on the low end with 20%. Interestingly, when I was doing it, the lowest margin industry that was out there are car dealers, which is not what you might think, right? Because we all think like we're paying tens of thousands of dollars. But because of the cost of the inventory that they have to maintain on hand at any one point, it often adds up quite a bit. So their cost of goods comes up a lot. On the highest side, clocking in at 97% standard margin, are financial institutions. So if anybody is interested in setting up a bank with me, let's talk afterwards. But again, to figure out what margin you should have, it's helpful to begin by looking at the industry that you're in and understanding what standards are, and then really delving into your individual products to understand what you might want to offer. Okay, and so I wanted to do is just share from our side the way that we have set up ours. One second. Which again, all of these are going to be available afterwards.
And Raj, while you're setting that up, Heather's asking a really good question. What about if you're a service where it's all about your time?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to our mentors for that because that's I'm not a service-based business. So I don't have as much experience. And it looks like, Peter, you have a response. Do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I was just furiously typing, Raj. But what I'll type is if you've got, I think Raj, you had a massage, studio as an example, right? So if you can apply a thing called direct labor. So for example, if every single massage I sell, I use exactly one product and it costs me $10 because I use the entire jar of massage goop or whatever, then I've got a direct cost of $10 per massage, right? Now let's say for every hour booked, I also have a direct cost of $60 that I pay the massage therapist. So now I've got a direct cost for the goop and a direct labor, which is also just a direct cost, but a direct labor cost of $60 for a total of $70. So my margin is 30%, right, Raj? Did I do the math right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the reason you might want to think about direct labor and direct cost differently is because direct labor can be applied in different ways. So if all sales in a channel, if you pay a salesperson, like the car lot, if you pay your salespeople 20% of the sales amount, you see how that 20% can be applied differently. It's not like the massage parlor. It's not a firm number. It's a percent of sales. So you can apply that a little differently, and it gives you a little more flexibility if you think of direct labor as similar but different from direct costs. If that helps. I'll ask Heather if that helps. Here we go. All right. And hey, Raj, I have a funny rule that actually might help Alex a little bit, but you can tell me if you like this rule or not regarding direct costs, because it's a really common question. Can I share that? It might
Please.
throw everything way off.
Nope, that'd be great.
Let me try this one out on everybody, see what you all think. So sometimes, again, if you have, a jar of something, or you're selling cereal, the box the cereal comes in costs 10 cents and you sell the cereal for $1, that's a very easy and obvious direct cost. Every time I sell $1, it costs me 10 cents. But there are lots of things that add very complex calculations. And Alex's example is the lights are on while I'm producing these boxes. So do I divide the cost of lights per month times, by the number of boxes I produce that month? And, Raj, my general rule of thumb is if it's very difficult to divide the large pile of stuff into all the products that they go into, then you might want to consider calling that a general expense. So Raj talked about a sesame seed bun earlier. If I buy sesame seed buns and plain buns, and one costs $2 and one costs $1, that's very easy. I should separate those two revenue streams and talk about two different margins. But if I buy 1 million sesame seeds at a time, and I put 5 on each bun on average, it's really hard to start including that as part of my direct cost, my costs of goods. And so what I might say is every month I just have an expense of sesame seeds getting shipped in, and I'll just do my best to call that. It's the same as electricity. It's the same as the receptionist at the front of the massage studio, that kind of thing. Sometimes there are just costs of doing business, and to Alex's point, those can be variable, but it's really sometimes extremely difficult to try to include those into the cost of goods, into individual cost of goods. And in my opinion, sometimes you shouldn't. Raj, what do you think about that? Controversial.
Thanks. No, I think it rings true. It makes sense. And I think what this also brings up for me is that so much of margin related conversation, like the devil is in the details, and really kind of digging in and figuring out what makes sense for you comes through applying this. So I think that makes a lot of sense as an approach. And I would also offer that if, it'll be largely business by business specific, and to also turn to mentors to help review your margin calculations to make sure that everything you're doing looks good and checks out. And so actually maybe I'll just segue then into what we got up here, which is just an example for you of the way that we calculate our margins for our products. And it's a fairly simplified example of just one product, in this case, our Nepali Golden Black, which is Caroline's favorite tea, that we sell through 3 different channels. Through our website, when we sell it to grocery, and then when we sell it to a distributor. And you can see that because it is the same product that we're selling, the costs are the same, but these are the types of variable costs that we put in. The purchase of the tea, the shipping of the tea to us, the purchasing of the packaging and the packaging shipping, the cost of actually putting the tea into the container, and then the cost of storing it. Then we also so that all goes into our unit cost. We factor in our credit card fees, because when we sell through both of these 2 channels, primarily we get paid by credit card, whereas when we sell through our distributor, we get paid by a check, so we don't have those same fees. And then here's our sales price. So on the right side of this, we've got the overall margin dollars, which is a pretty simple calculation of just taking the sales price and subtracting out the unit costs and the credit card fees. And then the margin is the same percent. So yeah, this is how we put it all together. You have your costs, you have your price, and then you figure out your margin based on that. And that really has helped us in a lot of ways driving decision making around what channels it makes sense to focus on based on which products we want to sell. And it's an evolving thing because a lot of these costs are always changing. So all of our pricing spreadsheets are living documents that require continual maintenance and upkeep to keep accurate. So let's then transition to the homework. So the part 1 is figuring out what your margins are, or where they ought to be if you haven't already done that. And so to do that, it's 2 parts. It's first to understand for your industry what typical gross and net margins are. And then to do the same thing that we had in that spreadsheet, which is just looking at what are your margins for one product if you're going to try and sell it through 3 different types of channels. And in addition to that, as Caroline was mentioning, we also want to have you record short videos explaining or reflecting on the impact of what RAINmaker has provided so far. And so we just have these 3 simple prompts, yourself, one thing you've learned, and one thing you'll do differently as a result. We'd love it if you could send it as a video, but that's fine if you can send it only as audio, and we can upload both of those into a standard homework folder rather. Here's some resources that we can share that are also linked to in the homework, discussing the 3 parts of what we covered: the margin, the revenue, as well as the costs. And I think we are just about on time. I think we're ready for breakouts.
Raj, I just wanted to jump in and say nice work, and thank you to the mentors who chimed in. That was good stuff, and I know you're going to get those Google spreadsheets out so that people can play around with them and plug their own numbers in. I also wanted to just clarify that they're on the video audio thing. We're asking for 2. They could be an audio or a video, and again, nothing fancy. The first one is the who you are, what you've learned, what you're going to take back. That would be due by the end of next session. And then the sales pitch one will be homework that Caitlin provides at the next Wednesday session. So you would then have another week to do that one. So hopefully that's clear. They're both under a minute. They could be audio recordings or they can be video recordings. Any questions about any of that? Cool. Yeah, and by the way, moving into video for your businesses, posting some videos in your blogs, in your newsletters, videos of yourself talking, videos of customers. This is really where things have been moving in the last couple of years. So we want you to get comfortable and familiar with that. And again, even an audio clip that you just send to customers and say, thank you for, being a customer. Thank you for the feedback, those kinds of things. So really want you to get comfortable with that. Great. Okay. Back to you, Raj.
Well, back to me and then back to breakouts. Why don't we dive into the breakouts and dig apart these pieces in more detail?